on low emission development strategies, LEDS LAC. I would like to thank you for being with us this morning and welcome you to a new webinar by LEDS LAC. I would like to thank also the World Resources Institute for partnering with us today to offer this webinar where we are going to talk about the way to estimate the greenhouse gas impacts of policies and actions. Before we start, I would like to say that LEDS LAC is the regional platform for Latin America and the Caribbean of the Low Emission Development Global Partnership, LEDS GP, which is a network of international organizations, governments, NGOs, and individuals that work in the promotion and implementation of low emission and climate resilient development all over the world. Every month we organize at least one webinar on topics that are part of the priorities identified by our membership. And one of those priorities consistently since we started working in 2012 has been the MRV systems. How do we account, how do we report, the impact of the actions and that we are taking. So today we are very fortunate to have the collaboration of the World Resources Institute to share with us the new standard for policies and actions, and then we will have an example from Colombia. So I would like to welcome our speakers today. Our first speaker is David Rich. He's a senior associate at the World Resources Institute, and his work is focused on monitoring, reporting, and verification. And he has developed the standards for accounting and reporting for climate change policies, mitigation targets, corporate GHG inventories, and other important areas of this work on MRV. And our second speaker is Magdalena Fandiño. She's a air quality and emissions specialist at the Clean Air Institute. She has worked for more than 5 years in the field of environment, especially in air quality, and she participated in the elaboration of the air quality management plan in Bogota, and she also audited the air quality management plan for the Aburrá Valley in Colombia. She has been working with the World Resources Institute as part of the technical working group in the preparation of the standard for accounting and reporting for policies and actions. So we are very thankful to David and Magdalena for being here with us this morning, for sharing their knowledge and experiences, and for being here also to answer to questions from the audience. Before starting the first presentation, I would like to say that we encourage you to write your questions in the space that we have for that purpose in your dashboard. You can write your questions either in Spanish or in English, and I will read them to the presenters after the two presentations. I would also like to say that both the recording of this webinar and the PowerPoint presentations will be available on our webpage after the webinar. So thank you again for being here. Thank you, David. Please, I give you the floor to listen to your presentation. Hello, David. You have to unmute your mic.
I've just done that. Sorry, it took me a second to figure out how to do that. Good morning, everyone. So now I will give you an introduction to a new standard that we have developed over the last 3 or 4 years through the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, called the Policy and Action Standard, which is an international standard for accounting and reporting the greenhouse gas effects of policies and actions. So first, let me explain a bit of background about the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It is an initiative that was convened about 15 years ago by the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development to develop greenhouse gas accounting standards. And so we've now developed several greenhouse gas accounting standards in a number of different areas. We provide standards as well as sector guidance for various different economic sectors, calculation tools for calculating greenhouse gas emissions from different sources, and we have some training programs around the standards. And everything we have is available at ghgprotocol.org, and everything we develop is free of charge and ready to be downloaded and used. These are the various standards that we've developed over the years for greenhouse gas accounting in different areas. The first is the corporate standard, which was developed in 2004, and that explains how to develop a greenhouse gas emissions inventory for a company or an organization. The project protocol was developed in 2005, and that explains how to quantify greenhouse gas reductions from individual mitigation projects, similar to CDM. Then we have the corporate value chain or scope 3 standard, published in 2011, which explains how to quantify greenhouse gas emissions from a company's or organization's value chain or supply chain. And the product standard, also from 2011, is about how to do life cycle assessment for individual products, which you can use to do carbon footprint of a product. And now on the bottom row, we have 3 new standards that have just been published over the last just few months, or 6 months, I guess. The first is the Policy and Action Standard, which I'll be explaining today. Then the Mitigation Goal Standard is about how to account for national or subnational greenhouse gas reduction targets. So either in a country's greenhouse gas emissions goals or INDCs that are now being developed, how do you track progress toward them? How do you account for them? And then lastly is the Global Protocol for Cities, or GPC, which is about how to do a citywide greenhouse gas inventory. So that's just by way of background to let you know that we have all these different standards available online if any of these other types of standards would be useful to you, but I'll focus the rest of the presentation on the Policy and Action Standard. First, in terms of how we develop standards, and in particular the Policy and Action Standard, we convene global stakeholder processes to jointly develop standards with experts and stakeholders from around the world. So WRI serves as the secretariat, but we had 270 people from 40 countries that were involved in developing the Policy and Action Standard. There was an advisory committee of 30 people that provided strategic oversight to the project. Then we had multiple technical working groups of about 80 people who did a lot of the the drafting of the standard. We had a review group where 130 organizations submitted written comments on the standard. And then we had a pilot testing group where we had 27 pilots where they tested out the draft standard and to see how it works in practice. And these are where all of the pilots took place. This was in 2013. We had 27 policies and actions that were piloted across 20 countries, which you can see here. In Latin America, we had pilots of the policy and action standard in Mexico, Costa Rica, Colombia, which we will hear from after my presentation. We'll hear in much more detail about the Colombian example. And then we had several pilots in Chile as well, and as well as the other regions. So now I'll explain what is in the policy and action standard. This is a picture of the cover. Oh, I should say before I continue, also we have a Spanish version of the standard online. So we've translated it into Spanish and French, which is available on our website. The Spanish translation is up there now, which you can download. We're also now just making a few corrections to the standard, so we'll have an updated version by about June 1st. But for now, there's also a Spanish translation that's available online. So the standard can be used at multiple points in time, depending on where you are in a policy implementation cycle and what your objectives are. So you can use the standard before you implement a policy or action when you're considering different policy or action options, and ask what effect is a given policy or action likely to have on emissions in the future. So that would be a forward-looking, or what we call ex-ante assessment. You can use it during implementation of a policy or action to ask whether it's on track and delivering the expected results by monitoring performance indicators related to the action and making sure that those are moving in the direction that you want them to. And finally, after implementation, you can look backwards and ask what effect has a given policy or action already had on emissions. So you can do either a forward-looking or a backward-looking assessment. The backward-looking assessment is called an ex-post assessment. So why might you want to do this in the first place? Why assess the impact of policies and actions? You can do this to inform policy selection and design by comparing different policy options based on their expected effects. So you might be considering whether to implement a couple different options, or you could be looking at one single action but asking, there are a few different design options for the policy or action, and you can use this as a tool to help understand what the greenhouse gas emissions implications are of that choice, and then make an informed decision about what policy or action to implement. Then after you've implemented it, you can then evaluate its effectiveness and cost effectiveness in delivering the intended results. So you may have expected that it would have had a certain effect on emissions before you implemented it, but after you've implemented it, you can then see whether or not it actually has the desired impacts that you had in mind, or maybe it hasn't been as effective and you need to either implement a different action or an additional action or something like that. You can use this to report on the greenhouse gas effects of policies and actions, either for various domestic purposes or various international purposes. For example, the biennial update reports to be submitted to the UNFCCC ask about the greenhouse gas effects of mitigation actions. So this can be used to answer that question and report on effects. It can be used to attract and facilitate financial support for mitigation actions, and in particular NAMAs, by estimating the greenhouse gas reductions that would come from implementing various actions, which many donors would require. And you can use this to not only look at the greenhouse gas impacts of policies and actions, but also various other sustainable development impacts or co-benefits that an action might have alongside the emissions impact, as well as costs. So you may well want to look at air quality implications of a policy, or public health impacts, or financial impacts, and so on. So all of that can be done alongside the emissions assessment when you do the assessment. Now here's a list of types or categories of policies and actions that the standard identifies. You don't have to have something that fits into one of these categories, but this is trying to outline the different categories that there might be. So we have regulations and standards, taxes and subsidies, emissions trading programs, voluntary agreements between government and industry, information instruments, which could be labeling programs or awareness raising campaigns or something like that, infrastructure programs, implementation of new technologies, processes, or practices, which is a general category and may catch things that don't fit into the other categories. And lastly is financing and investment programs. So the standard can be used for any of these types of policies or actions. And in terms of who should use it and for what, basically anyone can use it depending on their need. These are some of the categories of users that there might be, which might be government agencies, either at a city level or a subnational level or a national level. Donor agencies and financial institutions can use it to look at the impacts of investments. Businesses could use it to look at the impacts of private sector actions. And NGOs and research institutions can use it to do this type of analysis as well. And the applicability of the standard is very broad. So it can be used to assess the impact of any type of policy and action, such as the ones we saw on the last screen. It can be used in any country. It can be used to assess the impact of policies and actions that either increase or decrease greenhouse gas emissions. So it doesn't only have to be used for mitigation policies, although that may be where the main demand is, but you could also use it to assess any policy, whether it's a mitigation policy or not, and just to ask the question, what effect is it expected to have on emissions? And then it can also be used in any sector, and these are the various sectors that we had in mind during the development process, but it would work equally well in any sector because it's a very general methodology, so it works across the different sectors. And I mentioned before you could assess co-benefits or sustainable development impacts alongside emissions. So this is a list of impacts that we have in the appendix to the standard, where it lists different types of environmental, social, and economic effects you might want to evaluate alongside emissions, depending on what is of interest to you. So I won't read what they are, but these are some examples of things you can assess. However, I should say that different impacts will require different data sources and different models or tools. So the standard is general in that it guides you through an impact assessment for whatever impacts you're looking at, but each one will require a different approach. So now let me give you a summary of the methodology of the standard. There's 5 basic steps to assessing the impact of a policy or action. So first, you define the policy or action clearly with enough detail that would enable an accurate assessment of the impact, and this is dealt with in Chapter 5 of the standard. Then the next step is, once you've defined the policy, you identify all the various effects a policy or action might have on emissions, and this we deal with in Chapter 6, and I'll go into some more detail on this in the next slides. Then once you've identified the effects, you then estimate a baseline scenario and estimate baseline scenario emissions, and this means what would emissions be in the absence of the policy or action that you're looking at. So you need to do this in order to understand the impact. You have to understand what would have happened if you did not implement a certain policy. Then you estimate policy scenario emissions, which are what are emissions when you do implement the policy. And the difference between those two scenarios gives you the greenhouse gas effect of the policy or action. So the last step is just to subtract the two. So let me go into a bit more detail on identifying effects of the policy or action, which is in Chapter 6 of the standard. So the standard encourages that you use a comprehensive approach to think about all the different types of effects a policy or action might have, not only those that are the immediate effects of the action, such as those immediately designed to reduce emissions, but to think more comprehensively at all the different impacts, which might be intended but also unintended impacts a policy or action might have, impacts that might happen in the short term or long term, impacts that might happen in the jurisdiction that's implementing the action or in a neighboring jurisdiction, for example, where there might be some impacts that happen, which could be leakage, for example. And from all of these, you might have a combination of greenhouse gas increasing and greenhouse gas decreasing effects of the policy, and you should at least think about all of them before you move on to the step of quantifying the effects. So I'll just run through a quick example of how this might work. This is a table you might want to use to think about all the different types of effects. So for an example, for a public transit policy to promote uses of buses or subways instead of cars in a city, let's say, you might have intended effects that happen in the short term, which are that there's reduced emissions from cars because people are shifting to buses and subways. So that would be the main short-term intended effect you might want the policy to have. You might also have a longer-term intended effect, which is that people don't only switch from cars to buses today, but they actually change where they live or where they work, and this reduces the amount of distance people have to travel, and people can move closer to transit, and so then you have a second type of effect which also reduces emissions, but occurs in the longer term. So these are the sort of good things that you want to evaluate, but to be comprehensive, you should also think that there might be some unintended effects that the policy might have, which is that when you have more buses and subways operating in a city, you will have increased emissions from public transport due to higher use. So you might have twice as many buses running, and therefore the buses will be having twice as many emissions. You would hope that the reduction in cars outweighs the increase in buses emissions, but you should think about both to be comprehensive. And just to illustrate the out of jurisdiction effects you might have, you could have the fact that if you're having many more buses in operation in a city, you'll need to manufacture more buses, and that will likely occur somewhere else in the world rather than in your jurisdiction, assuming you would be importing those buses. So somewhere in the world, you would have some increased emissions from manufacturing of buses. So this is just a quick example to illustrate the different types of effects you might have and to think comprehensively about them before you quantify the effects. I'll just run through another example we have of a similar thing in the standard to illustrate a tool we have in Chapter 6, which is called the causal chain. And the standard encourages users to think about this in visual terms by mapping out how a policy or action leads to a series of causes and effects and ultimately leads to different greenhouse gas effects in the world based on the different lines of causality that a policy might have. So this is an example of a home insulation subsidy, which is intended to reduce energy use in houses. We use this throughout the standard. And to illustrate how this could work, if you implement the subsidy for home insulation on the left side of the screen, first you think about how it leads to what we call intermediate effects before it then leads to greenhouse gas effects, and the greenhouse gas effects are the ones in green. But first, if you implement the subsidy, it will likely lead to two things happening. One is that consumers purchase and install the insulation in their homes, but also businesses will produce more insulation to meet the demand for the new insulation. So if consumers purchase and install insulation, that will lead to reduced energy use in homes, which in this example, houses are using electricity and natural gas to heat their homes. That could change depending on where you're located. If you continue across the screen, if you reduce electricity and natural gas, you'll first have reduced electricity generation, and that then finally leads to greenhouse gas effects in the form of reduced emissions from power plants connected to the grid. And if you carry the line of thinking all the way to the end, if you have reduced electricity generation, if you're in a region that generates electricity from coal and natural gas, you may have reduced emissions from coal mining and reduced emissions from natural gas production, which feed into the grid. Now, going along the second line, reduced natural gas would also lead to a direct greenhouse gas effect occurring in the homes, which is that people combust less gas in the homes. And if you continue on from there, you may also have reduced emissions upstream from natural gas systems that produce the natural gas. Now, the third row is saying if you have reduced energy use in homes, people actually save money, and that's a good thing. But to be very comprehensive, you might think, well, if people are saving money, they may then have an increase in their income. That may lead them to buy more goods and services, which could lead to the increased production of goods and services, which finally could lead to some more emissions from manufacturing goods and services. Now, this may not really happen in practice, but it's an example of thinking very comprehensively about the impacts a policy might have. And then at the bottom of the screen, businesses producing more insulation would lead to increased emissions from manufacturing of insulation. So once again, this is just showing how you can sort of be creative in thinking about all the different impacts a policy might have. In this case, the green boxes show that there's 7 potential greenhouse gas effects that you might want to consider. And so the next step in the standard in Chapter 7 is about how to narrow that down to the effects that are most important and the things that you need to quantify. And to do that, Chapter 7 explains that you should narrow it down and prioritize the most important impacts based on 2 factors, likelihood and relative size or magnitude. And we explain with some guidance how to think about the likelihood that things would happen and the expected size of different impacts. But after you've gone through that assessment, you can then use this diagram to help you focus on the most important things, which are those that are either moderate or major in size, and those that are either very likely, or possible to occur. And anything that's minor or unlikely to happen can be excluded from the assessment. And so if you do this prioritization step, and we come back to the same example we were just looking at, here now we've done that assessment for those 7 greenhouse gas effects in green, and we narrow it down to just 3 greenhouse gas effects that are important, and those have a star next to them. And then through this process, we've figured out that 4 of them can be excluded from the assessment, and now we only have 3 effects to worry about, which are the most important impacts. So once you've done that, you then move to the estimation step, and I won't go into as much detail here, but basically the main challenge now, so in the example from before, we have 3 impacts we need to quantify. The main challenge is how to attribute changes in emissions to specific policies when things in the world change for a variety of reasons. So emissions can go up or down, not only because the policy and action that you are looking at, but also other policies and actions that are in effect in the same country that you're looking at, and various external factors that are also going on, such as changes in economic development, energy prices, which could be volatile, changes in weather, for example. If you have a very cold winter, people might need more heating. If you have a very hot summer, people might use air conditioning. And so the basic way to get around this challenge of figuring out why different things affect emissions is to define a baseline scenario and a policy scenario, which I mentioned earlier. So you basically have to say, what would emissions be in the absence of the policy or action that I'm looking at, which is the baseline scenario? And then what would emissions be in the presence of the policy or action that I'm looking at, which is the policy scenario? And that helps get around this complication. And then once you do that, you then estimate emissions in both cases. And this graph illustrates what that look like. So you basically define a baseline case, a policy case, and then the difference between those is the greenhouse gas effect of the policy or action, which can be represented in a graph or in an equation. And the equation at the bottom of the screen just shows the very basic equation for estimating the policy impact. As I said, this has been tested in many different countries. So this is just one quick example of a solar energy program in Tunisia. It was an incentive program to encourage buildings to install rooftop solar photovoltaic panels on the roof. And they did an assessment of what the impact was expected to be from 2010 through 2030. And they developed these two scenarios. And then they found the difference, which was about 4 million tons reduction cumulatively over the period. So this is just one example of how that was done in practice. And finally, just my last slide is one more example. In this case, is South African energy efficiency policy in the mining sector. And I just wanted to illustrate the value of doing both the forward-looking assessment as well as the backward-looking assessment that I mentioned. They did both, and first they evaluated the impact of this energy efficiency policy ex ante, which is basically forecasting what they thought the effect would be from 2006 to 2013, and they developed the scenarios in dark blue, and they estimated that they thought the impact would be 1.5 million tons reduction in 2013, but then in 2013, they looked backwards and they asked, well, what actually happened over the period as opposed to what did we think would happen? And that's the lighter blue color. And they found that the scenarios were actually quite different from what they expected to happen. So things changed that they didn't anticipate. Maybe oil prices dropped or natural gas prices dropped or something like that, which would change what happened in both the baseline scenario and the policy scenario. And also things were just much more volatile than they expected. So when you do a forecast, you probably have some simple assumptions about what you think would happen. But when you look backwards, you can see that things are usually much more complicated than you expected. So then they found out that actually the impact of the policy in 2013 in actuality was 1.09 million tons, which was a little bit smaller than they had expected. So this just shows the value of doing both the forward-looking and backward-looking assessment. If you can do so, it would probably give you valuable information. So that's a very brief overview of what's in the standard. Given the time I have, that's all I could cover, but I would encourage you to download the standard at the website on the screen. And as I said, we have a Spanish version as well, and we'll be updating that Spanish version in a couple weeks, but in the meantime, you can use the version that's there. And I'd be happy to take any questions you have after the presentation. So thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for that great presentation and also keeping the time. I hope that after Magdalena's presentation, we will have, well, we already have some questions, but I would like to mention that we are going to wait to the second presentations. I would like to thank the people who connected after we had started the webinar. I'm very happy to inform you that we are more than 90 people that are participating in this webinar from different parts of the world, the majority from Latin America and the Caribbean, but also from other parts of the world. Welcome. As I mentioned at the beginning, my name is Ana Maria Majano. I'm the coordinator of the Secretariat for LEDS LAC and also the Associate Director of the Latin American Center for Competitiveness and Sustainable Development. We had our first presenter, David Rich, who is a Senior Associate at the World Resources Institute, and he presented the framework for the policy and actions standard of the greenhouse gas protocol. And now we are going to have an application, a case, an experience presented by Magdalena Fandinho, who is an air quality and emissions specialist at the Clean Air Institute. Magdalena, welcome and thank you for being here with us. Please go ahead with your presentations. I would like to remind everyone that if you have any questions, please write them in the space provided for that purpose on your dashboard, and then I will read them to the presenters after Magdalena has finished. You can write questions in Spanish, and I will translate them if you do so. Thank you, Magdalena. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Ana Maria, and thank you everybody for taking the time to listen to us. I'm going to present the pilot project that we worked in with the World Resources Institute, applying this policy and action standard. So what we did was use as case study the air quality management plan of Área Metropolitana del Valle de Aburrá, which is a region in Colombia, and in particular we wanted to focus on transport policies and of this air quality management plan. So we did this work in collaboration with La Universidad Pontificia Bolivariana and also the local environmental authorities. They were very helpful, giving us information and helping us implement this case study. So first of all, the objective of this study was to apply as a pilot project our policy and action standard, and in particular in urban mobility in Latin American cities. So we wanted to evaluate the impact of greenhouse gases measures with the air quality management plan, and in particular we focused on CO2 emissions. We want to examine the effects of the measures acting together, so not only each measure, but only all of the measures implemented together, and also want to identify necessary inputs and methodologies necessary to implement on a bigger project that it's called the Integrated Environmental Strategy for Sustainable Urban Transport and Mobility in the region. So this is not only a pilot part of the policies and action standard, but it was also a pilot for us for a bigger project that is going to be implemented and that is actually being implemented right now, where we intend to evaluate more measures and more pollutants. So this is the region we worked on. It's located in Colombia, and if you've been to Colombia, maybe you've heard about Medellin. So it's a region that includes several small localities surrounding Medellin. So this is the whole Área Metropolitana del Valle de Aburrá, which I'll call the region of study or the region of interest, and from now on. So this is the basic methodology we used. For people that are familiar with estimating emissions and emission inventories, this is the standard bottom-up methodology we use. So we basically estimate emissions generated per year, in this case CO2, tons of CO2 per year, and to estimate that we use a number of vehicles for each type of source. In this case, each source will be, for example, motorcycles, taxis, buses, and among others, and then we use emission factors. So emission factors is going to give me how much pollution is my source contributing to, for example, CO2, tons of CO2 per gallons of diesel consumed. So it's the amount of pollution my vehicle generates, and we also use we also use fuel consumption. So that's only the amount of fuel per kilometer traveled, and finally the activity level, which is kilometers driven per year. So we use this equation for each type of vehicle, and then we of course add all the different types of vehicles to get our total emissions for each case. So we also use this model, which is LEAP. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. We use it because the university we worked with, they had all their information and all their inventories were being calculated with it, and it was already all of the information they had was already being formatted in this model, so that was very helpful. We used this as input, these variables, like the main variables. We use stocks and sales, which are just number of vehicles we have and the numbers of vehicles that are sold every year. Survivor profiles is this graph in the bottom that I have here. It describes the way my vehicles behave in time and how long do they live in time, or how long they survive. So the probability a vehicle that is maybe going to last 20 years for a certain type of vehicle could be around 20% for this example. And also, these are the policies that we evaluated. So we wanted to do an ex-ante estimation, so this is before implementation, as David explained. This is our particular evaluation, and we did greenhouse gas emissions. We evaluated in particular CO2 associated with mobile sources, and measures implemented included in the air quality management plan of the Área Metropolitana del Valle de Aburrá. So our policy 1 that we evaluated, I call it technology improvement. We wanted to see the effect of technology improvement of private vehicles, public transportation, and freight. So this policy consists on scrapping buses and trucks, also promoting introduction of better technologies. This means selling more better technologies like electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles, so introducing these technologies in our fleet, and reducing the number of two-stroke engine motorcycles. And I don't want to enter into too much detail, but this region has a very important problem with motorcycles. They have been growing at a very high rate during the last years, and they are a very important fraction of the whole of the total fleet. So it's one of the main focus of the environmental authority, especially in two-stroke engine motorcycles that have higher emissions than the four-stroke engine motorcycles. Okay, and the policy 2 is modal shift. So we wanted to promote vehicles to shift towards more efficient transport modes. So for us, more efficient transport modes are public transport modes, and in particular, we wanted to promote the BRT, that it's called Metro Plus for them. So they have been implemented some time ago, began implementing the BRT, so we wanted to see the effect of more people using that BRT. In particular, 10% of the trips of this BRT, we want them to come from cars and 5% from motorcycles. And also we want to see the effect and the reduction of growth on motorcycles to be less than 1%, which is very difficult to get, but we want to see the effect of this. These are not all of the transport policies included in the air quality management plan. We had to select only these 2 because of different types of limitations of information and assumptions we couldn't be able to make. So I'm gonna show you how we did our causal chain map. So a while ago, David explained this is one of the tools that the greenhouse gas protocol on the standard in particular gives us, and it was for us a very particular and useful tool to identify the different type of effects we could have with our measures. And again, we didn't quantify all of that effects. We just quantified a few. So I highlighted with a little star here the effects that we in fact quantified. But it was very important to still identify all possible effects, and this is a very interesting exercise. We had a lot of fun with the environmental authorities. We sat together, we did all the exercise, we identified the likelihood, the importance, the different types of effects we could have, and we just selected a few, and I'm going to show you to you. So I don't want to stay here too much and talk into much detail, but I just want to highlight a couple of things. So one of our effects, one of our measures was scrapping buses and trucks. So the expected effect of this was increase new buses. And so the amount of new buses in our fleet was going to be higher. So we will have less old and polluting buses, which will reduce our overall emissions. This is our intended effect. But we could also have some evasion. How? So instead of buses and trucks being scrapped, sometimes we see that we can have people selling their vehicles in other cities. This may reduce our emissions locally because we will still have a better fleet in our city, but we can have an increase in emissions in some other city, which is very important, in particularly when we're talking on CO2 emissions and global warming emissions. So we wouldn't want that. This is a very important finding we identified. Also, when we talked about technology improvement in cars and buses, so we want to sell more hybrid and more electric cars. So yes, if we sell more hybrid and electric cars, we reduce our emission factor, our overall emission factor, which will reduce our emissions. But maybe if this measure is too good and people are buying too many electric and hybrid cars, we could have more private vehicles driving in our streets, and this could increase traffic and congestion, which could increase emissions. So these are the type of interesting results and interesting analysis that we did when doing this exercise. I just want to show you how helpful this is and useful this is from applying the standard. This is just the causal chain map for the policy 2. We have a very similar result. So I'm just going to highlight the case of the BRT. We can, if we promote a lot of people to use the BRT and to shift from their cars to use the BRT, we can get saturation on our BRT, and that could make people shift back to cars and motorcycles, which can end up increasing emission, which is not desirable. So that's another example I wanted to highlight. Okay, so I wanted to mention some of the main challenges we encountered. It was definitely very hard defining our methodology. It's hard when you have limited information. There's always limited information, and there's always some decisions you have to make. So defining the methodology is very important, and it's also very hard depending on the particular case you're dealing with. And also identifying the causal chain was very fun, was very interesting, and it was a very helpful exercise that maybe we wouldn't have done before. So this was something that the people we worked with thanked a lot, and I think we got a lot of information out of it. And of course, we couldn't analyze all of the transport-related measures that we wanted to, and that are covered in the air quality management. Like, we have to select several. We have, for example, one measure that is related to reorganizing the urban distribution, so people use less, their need to travel less. So there's a policy that makes people want to live closer to work, so they, instead of driving to work, they can walk to work. So this is very difficult to measure, and this is very difficult to estimate and identify how to measure, how to implement it, and how to design this measure. So these are the kind of difficulties we encountered on. And also the accuracy of data in developing countries and everywhere, I think, is a challenge we always encounter. There's always nothing is accurate enough. There's always a lot of assumptions that we have to make and a lot of missing information. So this was also a major challenge. And this experience was important. We learned how important it is to clearly define policies and identifying all possible effects. So if you have your policy really well defined, you can identify all possible effects and which are likely to happen and which not, and which of those effects are important, should be included, even if you don't know how to include it, and which may not be so important. And also that causal chain map exercise can help you identify how to define better your policy. So that was certainly a very interesting exercise. Always there's uncertainty, and it's important to identify it. So that was also a very good exercise for us to do with as stakeholders in the city. We couldn't quantify all of our uncertainties. It was very hard, but we identified them all, and that helped a lot in giving us an idea of the general results and the significance of our emissions and how detailed can they be for certain or other cases. So it's also very important to identify when an estimation is not worth including. For example, if I'm estimating tons of CO2 and I have a lot of information, detailed information of the effect of traffic, but the effect on the traffic on a certain area or a certain type of car could be in grams of CO2. And if that is not going to have an important effect in my overall estimation, I should consider maybe not including it because it's really small. So things like that are things you have to have in mind, and we did, and it was very interesting to discuss. And also some other effects. We just didn't have enough information to estimate it, but you may want to don't include it in the end because it's not significant. So don't waste your time sometimes getting some information that may not be very representative of your results, or waste that time on other information that could be could have more weight and could be more important to include it. The overall standard was an excellent guiding process. It taught us a lot of things. It taught the environmental agencies and the stakeholders a lot of the helpful things, and it gives a very well-structured methodology to do these estimations. These are our overall results. I don't want to go into too much detail, but I'm happy to explain it more for those of you who are interested. I just want to give you the type of results we have. So in the upper graph, we have the number of vehicles and how they behave with time. So there's a different type of vehicles and how they've been growing and how are they going to grow. So I just want to highlight how important the number of cars are in my whole fleet, and they will keep being so. And also motorcycles. As I said, this is a major problem in this community, in these cities. So motorcycles are very important here. And I also want to highlight our results. These are CO2 emissions in the bottom graph, and how the CO2 emissions behave with time on our baseline emissions. So CO2 emissions are going to be very importantly represented by cars. This is an expected result. We have a lot of cars, therefore we have a lot of CO2 emissions with cars. There's also taxis, cabs, which are this purple bar. They are not a lot of cars here, but we know they drive a lot. So we're also going to have an important contribution from them. But what was surprising to see here was the result of buses and trucks. So as you can see, buses that are in yellow and trucks that are orange, they represent an important fraction of CO2 emissions despite not being very important in number of vehicles. So their emissions are very high at the end, and in particular trucks contribute to 25% of emissions and buses to more than 10% of emissions despite being less than 5% of the fleet. So this also gives us a lot of information on how to implement, where to prioritize our measures. These are the overall key results. So this graph compares my baseline scenario with my policy implementation and how do my emissions change over time with the implementations of each policy and the policies acting together. So these are CO2 emissions and how do they behave over time in my period of study. And as you can see, baseline emissions, which are the green bar, they grow. If I do nothing, emissions grow. But if I implement policy 1, which is the one that promotes, policy 2 promotes modal shift to more efficient transportation modes, we have a little bit of emission reduction. Emissions still grow, but they don't grow as much. When I implement improving the technology in private vehicles and transportation and freight, the reduction is a lot more significant over time. And of course, if I implement my policies together, the reduction is a lot higher. So those are my general findings. We do have low emissions from motorcycles, despite there are a lot, but we do have to identify that there are also other things that we have to take into account, like their impact on traffic and road safety. So this was just one of our findings. We also identify that the numbers of the cars are important because there are a lot of cars, so they of course contribute in a lot of emissions, but this is what I highlighted. Buses and trucks are responsible of 20 and 12% of CO2 emissions, despite only representing 5% of the fleet. And the measure 1.2, which was the technology improvement, and particularly including electric and hybrid vehicles, was very important and was the one that had the greatest impact on our measures. And of course, I want to highlight the usefulness of the causal chain map, which was essential to identify effects and implementation and how their effects are important, even though if we're not going to quantify them all. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any of your questions, and thank you all for listening and for your attention.
Thank you, Magdalena. Thank you for your presentation. We have a lot of questions, and I will read 3 questions at a time. And please, Rich and Magdalena, you can respond either one, or if you want to comment on all of them, I will give first the opportunity for the first round to David to answer, and then Magdalena. We have enough time for questions and answers. So let me start. We have a questions from Alexandra Zapata, and she says, and this was during David's presentation, at the stage where you are prioritizing impacts based on likelihood and magnitude, how do you deal with uncertainty and the potential lack of quantitative information? Another from Dora Lopez. What software are you recommending for GHG estimation? And from Hannah Marie Ahonen, regarding pilots for the policy and action standards, are there reports publicly available on these pilots? Please go ahead.
On the first question about the uncertainty when you're doing the assessment of prioritizing significant effects based on likelihood and size, the guidance says that if you don't know what the likelihood is, then just consider an impact to be possible, which is one of the categories of likelihood that is there. So if you don't know, you can just call it possible and move on from there. And similarly with size, I think, you know, basically you do your best guess. I mean, the idea isn't that it's a very accurate or detailed calculation, but just your best guess based on whatever information you do have on how it fits into the categories of minor, moderate, or major. I guess if you really have no idea, you could call it moderate and move on with the process from there. The software, we don't have any particular recommendations about different software that you can use, other than to say you should use whatever software you have that's appropriate. One thing we do have is on our website, the link I shared earlier, we have a Excel document, spreadsheet document that lists out all different tools and models that we know about, and you can sort it by sector and some other variables to narrow it down to things that may be useful to you. So we've tried to just compile different software that exists to help you find things. It may not be exhaustive, and it's not something you have to use, but we hope it's a useful resource. And if anyone knows about resources that we should add to that database of models, please let me know and we'd be happy to add more. The third question about, are the pilot reports publicly available? Right now, all we have publicly available is throughout the standard. We have a series of case studies to illustrate different steps along the process, which are taken from the pilots. And so those are what's mainly publicly available right now, rather than all the detailed reports, which we have not made public.
If I may, I would like to add to Alexandra's question about uncertainty. We did have that problem too. We couldn't quantify uncertainty, and the standard does recommend you have into account the type of aspects that add uncertainty to your results. So we did that exercise, and we couldn't quantify a lot of our uncertainty in this part of the process. But it was very helpful to list and to at least describe the type of assumptions we had to make, and where and which point does each assumption contributed to more uncertainty or less uncertainty. So we did a whole chapter describing in which parts of the process and which part of the variables have a lot of uncertainty and which assumptions. Sometimes we had to, for example, take a value from another city and to estimate certain amounts. Like, for example, the modal shift, and how is the modal shift going to impact cars and motorcycles from trips being done in those modes and in the BRT. So we had to use something. We couldn't use local data because we didn't know yet. There wasn't any measurements done on the BRT yet. So we did use some data from other similar cities. So those are the kind of things we listed. So that helps a lot to kind of also organize in your mind what type of assumptions you're doing and which are the ones that make your results higher with higher uncertainty or less uncertainty. So I hope that helps to answer your question.
Thank you, David and Magdalena. I'm going to read two questions from Kashmir. He asked first, how does the policy and action standard link to the goal setting standard and the city standard that you referred to, David? And also, can you confirm that the policy and action standard is a process standard, ensuring the user and a third party that a standardized process / menu was followed to derive the results? For comparing policies, how much standardization of the method / metrics for the GHG or other impacts is of importance. Do they exist? So I will stop with those two, and I think they are maybe for David. Please go ahead.
Okay. So on the relationship to the other standards, well, starting with the city standard, the GPC, that explains how to do an emissions inventory for a city or some other subnational region, like a city or community or something like that. So that's similar to doing a national inventory based on IPCC methods, but at a subnational level, and that tells you what the annual emissions are each year in a city. And you can then see what the trend is in total emissions over time and whether it's going up or down, and you can see what sectors are contributing most to emissions and that kind of thing. But the policy and action standard asks a different question, which is, what is the impact of a given policy or action on emissions? And so that's looking at what's the change in emissions relative to some baseline. And so there are different questions. If you're in a city, you might want to do both of them. So you could do a comprehensive inventory of total citywide emissions each year to make sure things are moving in the right direction, but then also use the policy and action for key policies to see what the impact of certain policies is. So they're complementary, but asking different questions. And then the goal standard, the mitigation goal standard, is answering a third question, which can also be done at the city level, which is about how do you track your progress toward a citywide or a national greenhouse gas reduction target. There's guidance in there on how to design a goal in terms of the different design choices you'll face, and it provides some guidance on how to think about those choices. And then it talks about how to track progress in terms of where you are in relation to where the goal is. It deals with questions about selling or purchasing offset credits or other market mechanism instruments and how that relates to the goal, and also deals with land use accounting, which is sometimes different from how the land sector is treated in the inventory. So all three really are the comprehensive package if you're interested in all three of those different questions, but each one is slightly different. On whether it's a process standard, I think we haven't used that terminology, but I think Magdalena had said it is a way of guiding you through the process of estimating the impact of a policy. I don't know exactly what it is implied by the word process standard. It's still focused on the technical aspect of how you do the methodology, but it is a sort of guide to doing the methodology. So I'm not sure exactly where that fits in with the term process standard, but I hope that helps a little bit. And then on the question, I think it was about comparison and different metrics. I'm not sure if I fully understood the question, but I think one question people have is since it's a general standard, could you just sort of compare the results of different studies that have been done according to the standard? And we would just advise that you use some caution if you're just going to compare the results, since it's a general standard, so you can make different choices depending on your objectives and depending on your capacity and amount of money and time you have to devote to the assessment. So what's I think really important if you're comparing two different results is that you need transparency on the methodology and assumptions that were used for each one. So you wouldn't want to just compare the final result, like one policy reduces 100 tons and one policy reduces 80 tons. You would want to know about the uncertainty of the results and the methodology and assumptions that were used. And the standard in Chapter 14 outlines all of the reporting elements that are encouraged so that you have the transparency you need to make meaningful comparisons across different assessments that have been done.
Thank you, David. I have some questions for For Magdalena, one is from Kiana Mejia. She said that they work with another regional autonomous corporation of the Guajira and would like to implement this work in their territory. And who can they contact and what would they need to do? And also, of course, that's both for Magdalena and David. And the other question, Magdalena, is whether this report is available and if the results are, if people can access to consult the results. And for David, are there examples where pilots have used the standard for forecasting backwards to pass the known data to test and improve their model and assumptions? Magdalena, if you can answer how if somebody in Colombia wants to have access to the information or see if they can start working on this in their in the city where they work, how can they go about it?
Okay, so the first question, I think it was related to somebody in Guajira, and I think you want to know if I have any contact in Guajira to do this assessment. We did.
No, I think the question is if they want to do the same, who would they contact?
Oh, okay, the same methodology. Okay, so you can consult with us. Right now we're doing this big work with Área Metropolitana Valle de Aburrá. We also had done some work, of course, with Bogota, some other work with Cali. We do have some methodologies and some tools that can be helpful, but for this particular case, we used information and methodologies already being used in Área Metropolitana del Valle de Aburrá. So I would recommend, if you want to implement this elsewhere in Colombia, of course, Clean Air Institute is very interested in it. Please contact us. We can talk in more detail. If you want to use, for example, the specific model and the specific methodology for this type of transport policies, I've invited you, or we can help you get in touch with the environmental authorities and the University of Universidad Pontificia Bolivariana, which were very helpful, and they have been working a lot in their models and their estimations, emission estimations on mobile sources, but also point sources in case you're interested. So of course I would invite you to contact us. I'm sure, I don't know if you got my email in the last of the presentation. I'm sure Ana Maria can send it to you. Regarding the other question, is the report available? So as I said before, this pilot was also a pilot for us to do a bigger project. So the pilot itself is not public, but we will have a bigger project where we are in fact estimating and doing several other steps in the process to identify the measures to be implemented in the environmental authority. So this is a part of an ongoing project which should have results in a couple of maybe 6 months. We already started phase 1. We're in phase 2 of this big project, and we're getting very interesting results. So yes, we will have results soon, we hope, but we do not have the pilot project results public yet.
Thank you, David. And maybe I would like to repeat the question on whether you have used there have been a case where the standard has been used to to calculate backwards to see the past data. And I would like to add another one for you, David. How much are considered the co-benefits on this new standard? This is from Alfonso Cordova. He says he wants to know this because in some cases they can be the same or more important than GHG emissions. This can complement and strengthen any policy and its implementation, taking into consideration the problems mentioned by Magdalena related to available data, emission factors, and therefore the levels of accuracy.
Yeah, on the first question, the pilots included both the backward-looking and forward-looking assessments, so ex ante and ex post assessment. I don't know the exact breakdown of each, but several of them were the backward-looking or ex post type of assessment, and some of them, maybe about 5 of them or so, were a combination of both the ex ante and ex post assessment, where you look both backwards and forwards at the same policy to look at the impact in both directions. On the co-benefits, the standard at multiple points in the process where you can choose to look at only emissions or also other co-benefits, it tells you, at this point you can also choose to look at other co-benefits and include them in the analysis, and then the appendix lists the different types of co-benefits that might be of interest to you. So, and then, the same process that I described earlier with identifying impacts, prioritizing them, estimating the baseline case and the policy case, all of that applies equally to co-benefits as it does to greenhouse gas emissions. So I think the standard is at this high level where it does walk you through that process for any impacts that you would want, but it does not give you the exact equations or models or specific data you would need for the different types of impacts, and those would vary by the type of impact. So if it's air pollution, you would need emission factors for SO2 or NOx or particulate matter or something like that. If it was economic impacts, like what's the impact on GDP or jobs or something, you would need an economic model to do that kind of analysis. So I think it helps you get there, but you would then need to complement it with these additional models to do the full analysis for co-benefits.
Thank you, David. I have 2 questions for
I would like to
Magdalena.
add.
Sorry, Magdalena, go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to add a little bit to that last question David just was answering about the co-benefits. We did. I just want to let you know that we are including co-benefits, and the standard is really helpful to in the process of how to take those into account. And even if you're also talking about emissions, it's really similar the way you could do analysis when you're looking at other emissions and CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions, because this standard is very general, but it's really good on walking you through a process of thinking and organizing your estimation. So it is very helpful to estimate co-benefits, and it has been very helpful for us in our process, because of this bigger project we are estimating other gases, other emissions, local emissions, and also we are taking into account impact on traffic, which also at the end has an impact on emissions, and also impact on accidentality, which is very important when you take into account motorcycles. So this are of course have to be evaluated separately, and you, as David said, have to have your own tools and your own methods, specifically emission factors and so on, to evaluate those aspects. But the standard is very good in helping you taking those into account too in your process.
Thank you very much, Magdalena. I have two questions for you. I'm sorry. One is from Manuel Oliva, and he is asking, based on your experience, do you think the standard could be used to help jurisdictions evaluate proposed policies before they are finalized to help craft policies with greater environmental impact? And from Sunil Sharma, he says defining baseline is challenging, especially when technology improvements happen on its own. Did you consider such scenario during building baseline scenario for energy efficient model of transportation? And for David, there is a question from Aurora Tripp. She would like to know what was the project in Mexico. What was the pilot project in Mexico? Thank you. Magdalena, please go ahead.
Okay. I just want to make sure I understand the first question. Is it you're saying that you want to know if the standard is helpful for jurisdictions to select policies before their implementation to get a greater impact?
Yeah, what I think what he's asking is whether the standard can be used by cities or by governments to evaluate policies before finalizing them, so to make sure that they are maximizing the positive environmental impact. I understand.
Okay, yeah.
So they use the standard to assess policies and not only, I think that's the question.
Yeah, so the answer is of course yes. In fact, that is one of the main objectives we are looking for. Clean Air Institute is working with the environmental authorities of Área Metropolitana del Valle de Aburrá to, in fact, prioritizing. So we're basically helping them to identify the best and the most effective measures to implement, because every government has limited resources and has limited time, but also wants to maximize their results. So what we want is to do an ex-ante estimation. So this is what we're working right now, and also measure during the implementation, which is also very highly recommended in the standard, and it's also very commented a lot. And you want to do that, of course, to maximize and also track how are your emissions being reduced, and if they are on track or not. What usually happens is that you always reduce less than when you expect. There's always uncertainty. There's always things that happen. There's always problems in the implementation. But the important thing is that you measure and you avoid, of course, some aspects that could reduce your emissions. So the implementation, the design of the measures also includes foreseeing possible outcomes that you want to avoid. So yes, definitely, this is one of our main areas of work in the Clean Air Institute, and this is one of our main focuses, using it for this particular case in this particular region. For the second question related to how the baseline is challenging, because there are already technological improvements that are happening on their own, and if we took that into account, yes, we did took that into account. In fact, every year vehicles are improving, even if you don't, for example, include hybrid or electrical vehicles. Every year vehicles are more efficient. So we did had a lot of trouble. It was a major challenge to include that, and in general it is. You want to include technological improvement, the natural or the by default technological improvement that will happen without you doing anything. So we did have to include it. I don't want to get into much detail, but the way we included it as kind of looking at what has happened in the past and the rate fuel economy changes. You know, fuel economy is a way to track technological improvement and the way your vehicle is more efficient with time. So newer vehicles are more efficient and consume less fuel. So there's a rate in which this changes, and every year vehicles are better and better. So we kind of try to follow the same rate of that improvement. Also, what happens is that old vehicles are scrapped or are used less. So we kind of wanted to also include that, because the older the vehicle is, first you use it less, but also the older it is, the more it pollutes. So you can have the same vehicle, but when the vehicle is older, the emission factor changes. So all of those aspects were certainly things that included more or less uncertainty in our results, and we did had to quantify them all. And some of them we could include them. The factor in which you use more a car, if it's old or new, we couldn't include it. It's really hard to estimate that, but you should at least acknowledge it. So yes, it was definitely challenging, and we did include technological improvements.
And the question about the Mexico pilot, and what was it?
Yes.
It was the Mexican Special Program on Climate Change, the PEC in Spanish, and that policy. I mean, it's actually many different programs that are part of the Special Program on Climate Change. So the pilot was on one of them, which was a program to replace older light bulbs with compact fluorescent light bulbs, CFLs. There was a program where they distributed CFLs free of charge to people in replacing their older light bulbs. So that was the policy that they did for the pilot.
Thank you very much. We are running out of time, but I think we have gone through the majority of questions, and I don't want to leave anyone without answering. I would like to ask a question sent by Thomas Gramming. He says, do you anticipate that the policies and actions standard will be used by in many NAMAs, or is the policy an action standard better as a starting point from where each NAMA should develop its own accounting? Do you have a view of what extent using the policy and action standard as a starting point for a NAMA can reduce the accuracy toward an economic growth path? We also have some questions from Kai Schmidt. He says, how does the standard address impacts from other national policies as well as international factors? And with regard to the ranking exercise just mentioned, was the WRI standard used to rank not only for GHG, but also with regard to other dimensions, that means the co-benefits? Please go ahead, David and Magdalena.
Okay. On the NAMA question, yes, it should be used, I think, as a starting point for the NAMA MRV with regard to estimating the mitigation effect of NAMAs, either forward-looking or backward-looking, and monitoring performance indicators for NAMAs. And it has been used on multiple NAMAs already, including the pilot phase included 4 actions that were specifically called NAMAs, and I think since then it has also been used for other NAMAs. But you will need to add some NAMA-specific elements. So depending on what specific NAMA it is, you'll have to define the specific indicators or the specific data sources and specific equations and so on. But it certainly is a starting point to guide you through the process and to provide also a international consistency across different NAMAs. So each one's not developing their own system from scratch, but they can all build on the policy and action standard as a common approach. In terms of other policies and how they're dealt with, in the standard, the way it's dealt with is in the baseline. So when you define the baseline for your policy or action that you're evaluating, you think about what are the other significant policies that are also in place that affect the same sources of emissions that your policy is affecting, and if the other policies are significant, you then include that in your estimation of the baseline case. So if your policy is doing nothing beyond what other policies are already doing, then this approach would show you that the effect of your policy is 0 because everything else is already in the baseline. But assuming that your policy has some additional effect beyond other policies that already exist, then this shows you the incremental or additional impact of your policy relative to other policies that are also in place. And then I think the last question was about rankings, but I don't think we mentioned anything about rankings, so I'm not sure I understood the question.
I think that was probably from Magdalena's presentation. Magdalena,
can you?
Yes. The question was with regard to the ranking exercise that you mentioned. What was the WRI standard used to rank not only for GHG but also with regards to the co-benefits? And I would like to take the opportunity to ask Magdalena. They ask what is the age that you consider for the chatarrization of the vehicles?
Yes, I'm going to answer the chatarrization question first. So we consider different ages depending on the type of vehicle. So usually buses and trucks have to get out of circulation. I think for trucks for buses is 20 and for trucks is 50. But we looked at the ages that buses and trucks actually had. So, and we saw there were, as I'm sure it happens in many other cities, there's a lot of old and buses and trucks that are not supposed to be in the fleet, that are older than what the regulation says. So we did the exercise of, okay, what if we, everybody just, the trucks and buses that are not supposed to be in the fleet are out of the fleet, and that gave us a little bit reduction, and we just increased it a little bit more. Let's say we have less, like 5 years less from each. But the way we did it is with the survival curve. So every type of vehicle has a characteristic survival curve, and what we did was change that curve a little bit. So most of the cars would go out of circulation before they actually go out of circulation, and that included complying with the regulation. So, but that also, because it's a curve, it's not like a cutting point, it's a tendency. So the percentage, the probability of a certain car of certain age would increase if they had, for example, 15 years to get out of circulation. I hope this answers a question, but what we used was basically our survival curves, and we wanted everybody to comply with the regulation of not being circulating when they were not supposed to. So that was the last question. And the one regarding the rankings, well, when I mentioned rankings, what we wanted to do was kind of organize how much effect did each policy had. And we did identify some policies that have more effect than others when talking about greenhouse gases. When you look at other pollutants, and that's when I think you were referring when you mentioned co-benefits. When we looked at other pollutants, this effect changes a little bit, but for the case of buses and trucks, and for our particular case, the importance of those two categories were very important. So yeah, that helped us give some idea of the impact that our policy have, but the way we should be ranking our policies is not only looking at how big the overall impact is, but how effective our measure could be. So if I have very few trucks and very few buses, but they contribute to most of our pollution, it's more effective to address those, because I'm going to have with less amount of money, let's say, I'm going to have a bigger impact. With less effort, I'm going to have a bigger impact than if I impacted the cars, for example, that the cars had a very big contribution, but there's so many of them. So we kind of had to use like also other things that what I mentioned, which are also mentioned in the standard, which are cost benefit evaluations. With those cost benefit evaluations, it's a lot easier to do that ranking that I mentioned, and to identify the best measures that you can implement, and that should give higher impacts on your population. So yes, the WRI and this greenhouse gas protocol and the standard helped a lot in making this process easier, because as we've mentioned, it is a very general, but it gives you steps and things to consider when you're doing steps, and it's totally doable with when you're talking about co-benefits. I hope that answers both questions.
Thank you very much. Just one final question. I know we are keeping you longer than some minutes longer, but we are happy that we are able to answer all the questions. And I think this is for you, Magdalena. Yeah. What about the financing of these policies that you are, or actions that you are evaluating in Colombia? What are the financing options?
Okay, so we are doing this, as I said, it's part of a bigger project. So the bigger project's been financed by the local environmental authority, and they basically hired the Cleaner Institute to assess them in the process. So they want to make sure the implementation of their policies have an impact, and then their designing and the effect that they're going to evaluate has a bigger impact. So we're assessing a project. They're an ongoing project and financed by the environmental authority, which is called Área Metropolitana del Valle de Aburrá. That's the name also of the region, but that's also the name of the environmental authority.
Thank you very much. I really thank you again, David and Magdalena, for your time, for your willingness to share with us all your knowledge and experience. We are happy to announce that we are scheduling another webinar with the World Resources Institute to continue the exchange on this topic, which is very interesting to our membership on MRD. So thank you for this initial cooperation, and we look forward to continue the exchange. Magdalena and David, much success in this great work that you are doing. And to everyone who has been with us this morning, thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, Ana Maria. Thank you for having us, and thank you all for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Have a good day.
You too. Thanks.
You too. Bye. Thanks.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.